There's a story told about Margaret Mead, who was once asked by a student, "What is the earliest sign of civilization?" Expecting to hear something like a cooking tool or some sort of weapon, the student was surprised at her response. She said, "A broken femur that has healed." In societies without modern medicine, it would take about 6 weeks of rest for a broken femur to heal. That means that someone would need to stay with an injured person to feed them, protect them, and care for them in the meantime. Where the law of the jungle prevails, there are no healed broken femurs. So the first sign of civilization is compassion, our caring for one another. As we continue to reflect on the theme of God at work, today's gospel presents us with an account of a very busy day in the working life of Jesus. We're still in the first chapter of Mark's gospel. Jesus is in Capernaum with his first disciples, Simon, Andrew, James, and John. In the passage just before the one we heard this morning, we learn that it is the Sabbath and that Jesus has been teaching in the synagogue, where he's been interrupted by a man with an unclean spirit. Jesus commands the spirit to leave the man, to the amazement of those present. And immediately, word of Jesus' healing power begins to get around. So today's passage picks up just after they've left the synagogue, when they go to the home of Simon and Andrew, and Jesus heals Simon's mother-in-law of a fever, his second Sabbath healing for those who were keeping track. And then at sunset, technically no longer the Sabbath, even more people were brought to him for healing, to be cured of illness or to have demons cast out. And we're told the whole city was gathered outside the door of his home. It would seem that the sun never set on Jesus' workday. This may sound all too familiar to those who work in the caring professions. What do I mean by caring professions? There are the obvious roles in healthcare, doctors and nurses, and those who work in clinical settings. There are those who work in community-based care and others who work in fields like education or rehabilitation or social services. The list goes on. And that's just the professional sphere. We might also consider the dynamics of care within our close circles of relationships. This might include our children or our parents, or others in our families of origin or our chosen families. Often, this is a hidden sort of work. We're not really trained for it. We don't get paid for it. Nobody sees it. We don't get days or nights off, and the job description is always changing. In short, most of us have probably, in one form or another, experienced some of the same relentless demands of caregiving that Jesus experiences in today's gospel. So let's look and listen for what we might learn about following Jesus while caring for one another. First, an important thing is doing nothing. Another way to think about this is setting a boundary between work and rest. Sabbath, it's a fundamental principle in Judaism. And though Jesus was often criticized for healing on the official Sabbath, it's important to note that he did seek out his own times of rest and renewal when he could. Throughout his ministry, we hear of him going off to a deserted place to rest and pray. And in today's passage, he managed to do just that, early in the morning before anybody else was awake. It's not long before his companions hunt him down. But still, we can learn from Jesus' discipline of seeking out a sacred space to listen and to reconnect with God. This is perhaps one of the hardest things to manage in caregiving professions, which so often do not adhere to a 9-to-5 schedule. When the needs in front of us never stop, how can we stop? And yet we know that we cannot, on a consistent basis, offer care from a place of depletion. We have to put on our own oxygen masks before we can help someone else with theirs. It is vital to establish regular rhythms of restoration in our lives, both at a macro level, the larger patterns of recreation like vacations or fitness or entertainment, and at a micro level, the tiny day-to-day practices, like a walk around the block between meetings, just a few stolen minutes of sunlight or fresh air, stretching, breathing, mindfulness, all little things that we can weave throughout our days to keep us sane. A neurosurgeon friend once told me of a colleague of hers who would always pause for a moment of what looked like prayer before he entered the operating room. Curious, and knowing that he did not identify with any particular religious tradition, she asked him once what he was doing. He said, "I know that no matter how well prepared I am and how skilled I am, there is still something beyond me that will determine whether this patient will live or die. So I guess I'm pausing in front of whatever that is." Whatever shape it takes, we can and must practice even the tiniest of pauses amidst the demands of caregiving. Doing nothing is something, and it's something important. Second, when it comes to providing care over the long haul, community is everything. And as this scripture passage demonstrates, community can look like a web of relationships in which giving and receiving care can overlap. We hear today, for example, about Jesus, who exercises curative powers. Then there's Simon's mother-in-law, who begins from a place of incapacity, then heroically bounces back to her usual role of serving others. There are the many suffering people in need of care, and then there are the disciples, the bystanders, who act as intermediaries, bringing people to Jesus. So together, all of these form a community of care, bound together by need, concern, action, and hope. The earliest phases of the COVID pandemic brought this home for us, when the perils of this deadly disease took what was an already challenging form of work and turned it into an even more hazardous job. Some healthcare professionals became sick and even died in the course of doing their work. I remember speaking with a friend who was a critical care nurse in those early days. And I reminded her of a conversation we'd had many years earlier, in the very early days of her nursing career, when SARS first appeared in Toronto. And I remember she'd said something to the effect that no job was worth risking your life for. And so in March of 2020, I asked her if she planned to continue working in the ICU. And she said, "Of course I'm going to keep working. Who else would take care of these patients?" She went on to say that she had never felt prouder of her profession or more connected to her colleagues than she did at that time. I also remember asking her, amidst the confusion and the shortages of those very early days, did she and her coworkers have enough PPE to go around? It turns out the local miners' union had turned over their entire reserve of N100 industrial respirators to their neighbors working in healthcare. Sometimes we can actually help by providing the oxygen mask itself so that someone else can put it on and keep doing their job. Community is everything. Finally, this gospel shows us that when we are anchored in God and surrounded by community, the potential for grace is everywhere. We see this in Jesus' determination to keep on going and continue his work in the neighboring towns, to teach and to heal and proclaim the good news that the reign of God has come near. Jesus keeps on going because he knows that grace can happen anywhere and everywhere. By grace, I mean when we encounter transformation or growth under very difficult circumstances. Grace is a gift from God, and it can come in so many different forms. It might look like the honesty or humility that can emerge from places of deep listening and support. It might look like presence, just showing up, just being there. For even when there is no cure, there can always be care. I remember speaking with an oncologist about the profound presence that his work requires, especially in walking with patients for whom there are no more options for curative treatments. He said, "People say your work must be so depressing, and I say no. It's often sad, but it's never depressing." And as people who work in end-of-life or palliative care will tell you, even when there is no cure, there is still space for all sorts of meaning and goodness and gratitude right up to the end of our lives. Which takes us to the heart of the Paschal mystery, which Jesus himself will embody. It is our Christian hope that even in the face of death, there is an even greater life that awaits us. It is this hope that sustains us, our very life breath. As we enter into a new work week, let's carry with us the good news of Jesus at work. Doing nothing is something, community is everything, and grace is everywhere. Thanks be to God.